Hello. Welcome to our live Q&A call, the first ever live Q&A call that I am doing for Human Amplified. And we have so much to talk about. So let's just give it a minute. I want to make sure that none of our patrons are going to hop on tonight, or if they are, I want to make sure I let them in. So this is just an informal thing, but since this is the first one, I do have some material planned, and I am going to hopefully just teach a little bit, and we'll see where it goes from there. But yes, all right, well, we'll jump in. So in case you don't know, I'm Brandi Fleck. I'm a storyteller. I'm the founder of Human Amplified. I'm a writer, artist, communications expert, the host of our top-rated podcast, Human Amplified, that's been around since 2018. I'm also a mom, a stepmom, cat mom, a wife, sister, daughter, creative, entrepreneur, mentor, introvert. I'm an INFJ on the Myers-Briggs personality test and an Enneagram 5 wing 4, if that means anything to you. And there's really so much more to tell as well, which I'm sure we'll eventually get to as we keep doing these calls. But honestly, to be vulnerable for a minute, I get way more nervous about live calls like this than I do about podcast interviews or teaching something that I get to pre-record. So please bear with me as I work out my nerves. I think they'll smooth out the more we do this, but I just felt like saying that. So enough about me. Let's talk real quick about what this time is for. Let me just make sure. Yep, did one last check to make sure I'm not missing anyone here. Okay, so what this time is for is, I'm calling it a live Q&A call, but it can also be considered an AMA, which stands for Ask Me Anything. So you can ask questions about podcasting, communications, art, career, relationships, trauma, overcoming trauma, human nature, for example, but you don't have to stick to those topics. Some months we could just hang out and chat. We could talk about life or anything that would make your day better in that moment. So I want this time to be valuable to you and never a waste of your time. It's all about having quality time together. So if one call is all about teaching and learning, you may want to come prepared to take notes. If you know you're more interested in the social aspect of the call, feel free to skip note taking and let's roll with it as it evolves and see what kind of magic happens, really. So since this is the very first live Q&A call, I did expect that attendance would be little to none as we just launched our Patreon tiers, but over time, I think this space will grow into whatever we want it to be. So for now, I'm going to answer some frequently asked questions. I get a lot, but don't always have the time to go into with as many people who ask. So I can do this for a while, for several calls, but really want this time to be valuable to you. So do please let me know what you need over time, if this is helpful or, just what you want out of these. I would love to tailor it to whatever you want. So if you're on this call or future calls live, it can be as conversational as you want it to be. If questions or comments come up for you while I'm talking or teaching something, feel free to ask live, or you can type questions or comments in the Zoom chat. Whatever you're most comfortable with. After the call ends, I'll post it in our Patreon feed and in our Backstage Pass resource library on humanamplified.com/backstage-pass. So you can find the password for that resource library pinned in the password category at the top of our Patreon feed. Once I post the video there in our feed, I'll also start a new thread in the Patreon feed for our next live Q&A call that's coming up in February. So this one's in January. There will be one post per month for the live Q&A call, where you can just comment questions as they come up, and then I'll address them each month. So yeah, hopefully that straightens out the logistics there. Would love to get the logistics just taken care of. But so if you're watching the replay of this video and questions, comments, or thoughts come up, absolutely feel free to post them on the thread for the video, this video in the Patreon feed, or you can post them in the thread for the next call. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just let me know. But I want to be sure to get back to you in the next call, whatever questions or comments you have that come up. So that's that. I do have a very important ask of you, though. Please don't share the replay video of this call or any future live Q&A calls. We are using the honor system, and I'd really appreciate that you'd adhere to it, which I'm sure you will, but I have to say this, these calls and replay videos are meant for each individual who has purchased a Backstage Pass tier or higher through the Human Amplified Patreon, and this ensures that I get to keep the podcast running. So if you know of someone who would benefit from these calls and access to these video replays, do absolutely feel free to send them to our Patreon to sign up, and I would so appreciate that. All right. Now let's jump into questions about podcasting, which I know some of you have been waiting for, and there's so much that goes into it. There's a lot to think about, whether you're just starting or you're trying to grow, build your audience, or monetize. So I'll try to start from the beginning and cover as many of the basics as possible. And then if this is something that you're still interested in, we can dive deeper or get more technical in other calls, okay? So I like to do big overviews and then drill down into specific topics after we've done the overview. In my experience, that helps you learn a little bit better. So I'm going to give you a list of the most frequently asked podcasting questions that I get. And by extension, some of these are also business questions, because I've set my podcast up as a business from the get-go. Some people don't do that, and that's okay. But I'm going to tell you about how I've done things. And so some of these things that come up are business questions, but you'll see. So let's just get into the list. So people typically ask me a lot, why a podcast of all things that I could do content on? They also, or how I could put content out there. People also ask, how do you start a podcast? Or what are the most important things I should think about when starting a podcast? Those two sort of go together. Other huge ones are, what software do you use? What equipment do you use? AKA, what kind of mic do you have? And what is that huge thing on your mic? I get that all the time. Every time I'm on a Zoom call with a guest, they're like, that's an interesting mic. I've never seen that before, but really it's just a huge ball of foam that's on top of my mic, which I'll show you. Actually, let me just show you right now if you haven't seen it. Look at this guy. A lot of people have probably seen it, but this, and we can get into this. I wasn't planning on telling you, but since I've got it here, this is called a Chaotica eyeball, and it's like a mobile vocal recording studio is how they bill it, but it was made for singers and vocalists and sound recording in that way. But it really helps dampen sound in a room. And that's lingo, but all that means is it basically helps stop some of the echo that you get when your mic is so sensitive. It picks up all your voice bouncing off the walls and all of the things in the room that you're recording in. So we'll go over all of that type of thing, at least some. Maybe we'll cover the basics today, but anyway, okay. Other huge questions are, where do you record, which sort of goes hand in hand with the equipment, and then how do you get guests? So those are my top ones, like super top ones. But some of the other ones are also, I get a lot of questions about how much time do you spend on an episode? Should I have a website, or should I just do lives on Facebook or something like that? How did you form an LLC? How did you come up with your topic or your topics? Why did you rebrand from On Being Human to Human Amplified? What was your process for choosing the colors and brand image? What is it that you do? I don't understand what you do. Oh my gosh, that question is a little problematic. If you have a business and there's somebody out there who doesn't understand what you do, they're either not part of your audience and they don't need what you have, or your message is not clear. So I did get really clear on my message, but that came up in the beginning, and that's fair, and that can happen. So I want to make you aware of that. Let's see. Another question that I get a lot is, do you make money off your podcast? How do you monetize a podcast? And what is the method behind your social media strategy? And more specifically, should I even be using LinkedIn for a podcast? So, man, some of these are really huge questions with some complex answers. So let me just reiterate. If you're watching the replay and a question or thought or comment comes up for you while I'm talking and answering these questions, which we're going to do in just a minute, post your thoughts in the thread for this video in the Patreon feed, or the thread for the next live Q&A call in the Patreon feed. Commenting in either of those places in the Patreon feed will ensure I address your questions or thoughts in the next live Q&A. You can always find out when the next live Q&A call will be by either searching the Patreon feed or checking our events page at humanamplified.com/events. Okay. So without further ado, let's get into the answers. Okay. So things to think about when starting a podcast. Let's start there. While some of the list I'm about to give you could apply to beginners or someone who's already established but wants to add a podcast to their offerings, this list assumes you don't already have a business or website you're adding a podcast to, but that you'd be starting a podcast from scratch. Okay, so that's how I'm going to try to approach this. But some of the answers could definitely, like I said, apply to someone who's already established and wants to add a podcast to an already existing audience. But yeah, so anyway, so here we're addressing the first question in the list I just gave you, but I'm going to give you another list. I guess I really like lists, but I'm going to drink of water. So how are you going? I want you to think about, if you want to start a podcast from scratch, these are the things that I think are the most important to think about. How are you going to host, as in have a web presence? Like, where is your podcast going to, where's its home base going to be? What equipment do you need? What do you want your podcast to be about? How will you create content? Because there's lots of different options for all of these things that you could choose from. How much editing will you do, and who will edit your podcast? Is your topic and content risky or pretty tame? And what's in a name? You definitely have to check to make sure it's not taken. And I have some lessons learned about that, even though I did all the checks that I could possibly do. It's a big deal. You also want to think about branding, art, and following specs for art for podcast platforms like Apple and Spotify. That's really important, because if you just go out there and you create a free graphic or throw something together, if it has, if it infringes on someone else's copyright, or if it's not even the right size, in dimensions, but also it's too large or something like that in terms of file size, Apple's going to reject it. And if Apple rejects your podcast, it's just not going to be heard very much. And if Apple rejects it, the other platforms will probably reject it. So that's huge. And some of this stuff does get really technical. So I'm going to try to stay sort of surface level and basics so we don't get confused. But one other thing I want you to think about is audience building and having realistic expectations around that. Audience building takes a long time. It's not for the faint of heart. And yeah, so realistic expectations would be to be patient. But anyways, so those are things I want you to think about. Some of the answers to these points that I want you to think about will cover when we dive deeper, when we dive deeper into these, they'll cover some of the other FAQs in the list too. And so before the call is over, I want to go over a lot of that, but I also want to make sure we talk a minute about season 4 that's coming up on January 11th. And that's because that really relates to the question, how do you get guests? Because that has evolved over the years for me and Human Amplified. And it's really taken a turn after season 3 when we were planning season 4. So let's just see how far we get through this list of things I want you to think about when you want to start a podcast. And if we don't get through it all, we'll try to cover all of this stuff in the next calls. I mean, I've got one planned every month for this year at the very least. So we can take our time, whatever we need to do. Okay. Let me just check one thing. We're good here. Okay. So the first thing in the list that I want you to think about is, how are you going to host or have a web presence? So when we're talking about where you want your podcast to live, do you want to have a website? Do you want to have a podcast host your website like Anchor or something like that? Or do you want to do Facebook Lives or something like that? And when I get this question, I always say, have your own website. That's really important, because if you have plans to monetize, or even if you don't have plans to monetize, but your podcast hits it big, let's say you pick a topic that people just love, like true crime, for example. I mean, that's one of the hugest genres of podcasts. And so let's say that you hit it big, but you're not on your own website that you are hosting yourself. It's going to be harder to monetize. It's going to be harder to own the rights to your things. And at a moment's notice, an algorithm on Facebook could change. Less people would see your episodes. Less people would see your lives, something like that. I don't actually know much about Anchor because I use Squarespace to host mine. So I own that website. I pay for it. And I can monetize. I can add sponsors if I want to. I can place ads if I want to. And that's only if I want to. But because I'm not in a podcast network, which what do I want to say about this? It's because I'm not in a podcast network, I don't have to place ads I don't want to place. For one, I have a lot more control. And so if you were starting a podcast, I would want you to have as much control as you want over your podcast, because a lot of blood, sweat, and tears go into it. It's fun. It's amazing, but it is a lot of work. So I do want to set that expectation. You see a lot of articles out there that are like, oh, you can start a podcast in 5 minutes. There's only 3 simple steps or something like that. But once you get into it, if you want it to be good, if you want it to sound good, if you want people to be interested in it, if you want to build an audience, it does take time. Okay. So I would say have your own website. That's my preference. However, there are tons of places out there that you can get a website from, so that's something we can dive deeper into a little bit later. What equipment do you need? Well, this is sort of easy. Like, you can get as complex and techie, nerdy as you want to get with this, or you can be super simple and you can produce a podcast. Of course, the type of equipment you get will affect the sound quality. It will affect your ability to do certain things more efficiently or something like that. But there are a lot of really good options out there that don't cost an arm and a leg, that are just sufficient, better than sufficient, I guess is what I want to say. So to get started, really, you need a microphone, and it doesn't have to be the most expensive microphone in the world. You need a pop filter. If you have a professional microphone, you definitely need a pop filter because they're so sensitive. It'll pick up clicks and pops and mouth noises, and that's very distracting. And you don't want to have to edit those out because that would take you forever. So microphone, pop filter, a computer. And to get started, that's really it. You need something to record audio on too. So you need software, but we can get more into the software a little bit later. Honestly, I started with a MacBook Air. And some headphones. You probably want some headphones. So if you don't want to spend a ton of money on a professional mic, if you use Zoom and a USB headset with a microphone that has noise canceling capabilities, you can record a podcast. You can record a podcast with Zoom and literally just your laptop if you want. I mean, like I'm doing right now, recording this call, it won't sound the highest quality, but it won't be near bad. You know what I mean? So there's a very low barrier to entry to start a podcast. It's just, I think that's why so many people have them. They're fun. And I mean, the market really is, it's almost like everybody has a podcast now, and that's okay. And I love that. But because the barrier to entry is so low, but you can, keeping it going consistently is another story. Can you do that? Can you improve on the quality as you're going? You start somewhere. Absolutely start with the bare minimum, but then build on that as you're going and keep it going consistently. Okay. So that's the base, the bare minimum of equipment that you need. What do you want your podcast to be about? This one's interesting because we could talk for hours about how to niche down, which, okay, let me go on a tangent real quick. The word niche, I always said it was niche. And like growing up, we learned that, animals had a niche when we were talking about biology and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden one day I woke up and everybody was saying niche. So how do you say it? Is it niche or niche? And like, I nerd out about stuff like that, but I want to say niche, but I'm going to say niche because I don't know, it's like ingrained in me now. But anyway, that's probably too much. So when you're thinking about what you want your podcast to be about, there are so many routes you could go. And I guess the most important things to know, if we're sticking at surface level, is you could have a variety show, which literally could be about anything. And it would be easier to come up with topics. It would be easier to create content, but it would be harder to build an audience quickly. That is the type of content that will take the absolute longest to get out there. And that is because if you are not targeting one subset of people with specific interests, it takes a longer time to build up categories of content that specific subsets of people are interested in. So it disperses to a wider audience and therefore doesn't reach as many people because, well, I won't get into the because right now. That's really technical that we can get into later if you want to know. But that's that in a nutshell. And you have to weigh the pros and cons. Do you want it to be a little bit easier to have content all the time because you can literally create content about anything? Or do you want to build your audience a little bit faster and sort of narrow down your focus more? And I think that business leaders and gurus would tell you that you definitely want to niche. You want to focus in on a particular topic for your podcast, or this would translate to you want to, excuse me, the air is so dry because we have the heat really high because it's like a blizzard outside right now in Tennessee. I say a blizzard, it's only like 5 inches of snow, but niching down was one of the hardest things that I had to do with my podcast, because with Human Amplified, yeah, we are focused on amplifying humanity and humanizing people and telling personal stories and addressing the elephant in the room about societal issues that need to change. But when you're talking about the breadth of what it means to be human, that is huge. It's a really wide topic. Lots of things are included in it. So, really, when it comes to a niche, it's more about, it took me a couple of seasons to narrow that down. And so now it's more about connection and healing support, which is the focus in the bigger picture of amplifying humanity, because those are the types of things that I think will help us change society and reach our mission. So when you're thinking about the type of content you want to create and you're trying to narrow down a theme or a topic or even an overall topic that you can hone in on in different ways in different seasons or different episodes or something like that, because you can look at different topics through various lenses and perspectives. And so there's really a lot of wiggle room even when you focus. And you might find that it helps you be more productive with your content and things like that. So, but that kind of focus allows you to build an audience a little bit faster. It allows you to discover who your audience is a little bit faster, but you could spend a little more time creating content and figuring out how to get them what they need. So, I mean, there are tons of pros and cons we could weigh on this topic. And there was something else I wanted to tell you. And this is why live calls make me a little bit nervous, because I have to think through things sometimes when I'm talking, and but hopefully you'll know that about me and learn to love that about me when you're not listening to like an edited podcast video. So anyway, I think that's enough to say about that. What do you want your podcast to be about? Oh, I do want to throw in there too. Think about when you're trying to determine a topic, one ingredient that would make your podcast last for the long haul is if your topic aligns with your personal core values, because then you can tie your podcast mission to your personal life mission. And that makes it so easy. It makes it easy to keep working toward it when it takes a while to build an audience. It makes it just something you want to do that's fun, even though you might not be getting paid for it in the beginning or right away or ever. It just depends, right? So once you've decided what you want your podcast to be about, then you need to think about how you'll create the content. And gosh, this is really complex too. There are lots of different types of content. There are lots of different ways to deliver it, even if you're doing a podcast. There are lots of different formats you could choose to do an episode in. And you could experiment with several different forms of content and episode types and things like that. But consistency is pretty key in building an audience. So you want to weigh your experimentation again with consistency, and eventually you'll want to narrow it down to a couple of different types of content, a couple of different, maybe one format for your episodes, or if you do a couple of different formats for episodes, depending on how often you put different episodes out. But so the basics would be there's like connection content where you tell personal stories. There's informational content where you teach or inform. There is, there's, well, so those are two main types that we use, but we also, when you're thinking about how you're going to create content, you might just want to do a host episode. You might be the only person on your podcast because you have so much information. You could do tutorials, you could do how-tos, for whatever topics. You can, well, there are a lot of ways you could go. And my mind is blanking on some of them at this point. But when we get into formats for your episode, you could do interviews, you could have a co-host. I mean, you want to decide not only in terms of what would it be easiest for you to come up with the most on the most regular basis, but also what would your audience respond to the most. A lot of times, I know I get a lot of engagement on videos, but a true podcast is audio only. But there are ways you can turn that audio into a video for people to still find it on video platforms, for example. So that's really technical too. All the places you want to put this content is very technical. But first of all, you really need to decide, am I going to interview people? Am I going to teach people? Am I going to inform people? Am I going to connect with people? Yeah, who are into whatever it is that your podcast is about. And no matter what type of content you choose to create or whatever format you choose your show to be in, you'll want to decide how much editing you want to do and who will edit your podcast. And if you've never edited a podcast before, it's, I don't want to color your opinion of it because I don't love it. I don't love editing, but I learned how to do it. And it's a learning curve, and it's pretty tedious work. It's very detail-oriented work. So I know some people love detail-oriented work, which I do to an extent, but you can get really picky with editing, or you can have more of a realistic flow, long form type of episode where you don't edit a lot. It just depends on the feel and the tone of your show and what you want your audience to see. Do you want the episode to flow from beginning to end? Do you want there to be segments so you put ads in between the different segments, or do different things in your episode? Maybe for 15 minutes of an episode, you want to interview somebody, but maybe for 10 minutes of an episode, you want to talk about, I don't know, pop culture or do a review. And then maybe for another 10 minutes, you want to go over some news highlights or something. It really just depends. So The one with the least amount of editing is the long form, from where you start recording from beginning to end and you just publish whatever you recorded in that time, sort of like we're doing with this call. I'm not going to edit this call at all. But with the podcast, I started out editing sneezes, coughs, if a dog barks or we have a blooper, I edited that stuff out. We edit out as much as we can. Sometimes we move around one portion of the interview to another part to make it flow better. My husband started helping me edit, but back before he started helping me edit, and he's got a lot more experience with that editing and sound software than I do, I learned how to do it and did not move content around, but only took care of the things that were super distracting. So that's more of a long form. Also, when you're doing interviews, if that's what you choose to do, for me and for Human Amplified, it's always really important that our guests feel safe to talk about whatever they want to talk about, and tell their life story, talk about some really sensitive topics. And part of making the space safe for them to share their story in a public way, which can be really hard and nerve-wracking to do, is letting them know that I am not going to publish something they don't want published. So that sort of goes against, I do have a journalism background, and that goes a little bit against what we're taught in journalism school, because if your source or your guest is on the record and they're talking about something, it's typically fair game, unless they say it's not on the record, and then you honor that. And, a lot of times when people agree to come on, they will say something they think they're okay with, and then later they might become uncomfortable with it and want you to edit it out. So if you're going to do interviews and you want to create a safe space, I would say honor your guests' wishes, and it's not going to hurt your show. It will help you build a relationship and a rapport with your guests, and you will get a reputation for taking care of your guests, and then more guests will want to come on. So I guess the point is know how to edit enough to edit out things that your guests might become uncomfortable with. Okay. And if somebody says that they don't want you to publish something, or they don't want to go on the record for something, I wouldn't do it, even if it's good, even if it's juicy, whatever. And that brings me into, is your topic and content risky or pretty tame? And this has a lot of different aspects to it too, but the one that I think is important for beginning is, if you're interviewing people and it's about pretty personal topics, I would say it's riskier than if you're doing a show that is about teaching someone how to play video games, for example, right? That would be pretty tame. And even if you cuss, use expletives, whatever, that's still pretty tame in terms of risk when you're creating a podcast, because it's just you, right? You're not bringing anybody into it other than the person who's listening, and they're going to get something of value from you. But when you have guests on your show, you add a liability to it, which, and I'm not, it doesn't have to be a scary thing to worry about, but you want to take care of them. And this actually brings me around to, that is why I decided to create Human Amplified, which is On Being Human LLC, is why I decided to create it as a corporation, because an LLC takes some of the liability. So like if I were to ever get sued, which, let me just say, I do ask my guests to sign release forms, releasing liability, because we talk about such personal topics. And some of them are just so like heart-wrenching and traumatic for people, but they know they're going to be taken care of. So I asked them to sign a release, and also I created the LLC to, if someone ever sued me for anything, God forbid, my personal assets would still be my personal assets, and the business assets would be what could be taken if they had to be. So that's a good reason to create an LLC. Now, all that to say, if you are interviewing people, depending on what your topic is, it still might not be that risky. Like if people are talking about their, first memory they've ever had, or they're coming on to talk about the best restaurant in town, or, a book they read, it's probably not something you have to be worried about. But libel and slander are things that you do want to think about when you are creating content that could be, it's for entertainment purposes, but it's media. When you're doing a podcast, you need to think about media law, because it could come into play at some point. And that's really important. So I think that's all I want to say about that at that point. Again, listen, if any questions have come up for you while I'm talking about this, let's dive deeper. Just let me know in the Patreon feed on either the thread for this video playback, or then the thread for the next live Q&A call, and let's address some of that stuff. But there is a podcast lawyer who I found when I was first starting. His name is Gordon Firemark. He's based out of LA. And he has an ebook, which I hope he still sells this ebook. It was only like $20 4 years ago, but he tells you all the ins and outs that you need to think about when it comes to liability and the legalities of having a podcast, producing content, media content, and especially if it's involving other people. I mean, there are copyright laws, there are communications laws, there are all kinds of things that you just want to be aware of. And maybe that's the overachiever in me, maybe that's the journalism background in me, but I know that a lot of people who have indie podcasts don't always know all the laws, but I want you to think about that, okay? So you don't have to have an LLC. To sum it up, not every guest show with interviews is going to be risky, but you need to weigh the risk versus the benefit and inform yourself about those laws. And I can help you with some of that too, but for now, that's good. That's also tied into what's in a name. So if you're going to start a podcast, you got to name it. It is sort of a pain to change the name later. So, do a search on Apple Podcasts, see if it's taken. Do a search on GoDaddy, see if a URL is taken. Do a search on Instagram and see if that account is taken. There is a trademark database that you can do a basic search on for free. I mean, the government has it out there, and you can see if there is a registered trademark for the name that you're thinking about, or anything close to it. And that's all just basic things you want to do before you name your podcast. And that can be hard. A lot of names are taken. But that's important. So you also want the name of your podcast to appeal to the people you mean it to appeal to. So you want them to know sort of what it is, or at least pique their interest. Okay. And then once you have the name, you do need to come up with branding and art, so that at the very minimum, you can get onto Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Okay, there are a lot of other podcast platforms like Stitcher, Google, Amazon Music, Pandora, iHeartRadio, tons of podcast platforms. Once you start a podcast platforms will start contacting you saying you need to claim your account on their platform. And, but the bigger ones I just mentioned are the ones that you need to submit to. But it's like, once you're on those, it just sort of spreads, okay, to other players, to other apps. It gets out there. But in order to be on those, you have to meet the branding standards and have a cover art for your podcast. You don't have to have cover art for every individual episode, but I do. I think it's a good thing to have a different cover for every episode, because you can submit that when you publish episodes. But if you don't have the bandwidth to do that, one piece of artwork for the cover of your podcast is sufficient, and you can use that for every episode. So that's important. You can use Canva for free to come up with art and branding, but if you want it to grab someone's attention, you can hire a graphic designer. You can look at other podcasts that are in your genre and see what their cover art looks like, and really go from there. I won't go too much into all of the branding, but at a bare minimum, you definitely need cover art and a logo. You'll want a logo. And then we've already talked about audience building and having realistic expectations around that, and sort of all of the things that you decide and all of the other points we talked about, will impact audience building. And that's why I want you to have realistic expectations and weigh the pros and cons of each decision. So if you do want to make any of these decisions, feel free to ask me if you need help, if you want me to weigh in on what I think some of the pros and cons are, what your options are. I'm happy to do that. So I think that's the basics. I mean, there's so much more. It's just, I've learned so much over the last, about 4 years of doing this podcast. When I started, I did not know anything. It was a labor of love. It was just fun. And I don't even know, like, it's so different now. It's so different than it was when I started, but I did it from scratch. And I did it really I had a journalism background, so I know how to interview people. I know how to build relationships. I know how to take care of my sources, but I didn't know how to podcast. I knew how to write. I knew how to do art. So that was important. But if you don't know how to do those things, you can get help with those things. Okay. So it's within reach. You can do it. It's fun. It's time consuming. And it builds character. I will say that. And I think it's totally worth it, even if other people have podcasts, and there are so many podcasts. And one thing I will say about that, when you're choosing your topic, or you are trying to come up with what you're going to do, if you feel like the market's saturated, it probably is. Okay. I mean, like I said, there are a lot of podcasts out there. There are a ton of podcasts out there. They're like a dime a dozen at this point. But you can come up with something that sets it apart from somebody else's podcast. I promise you that. There is always a way to differentiate yourself with the audience that you want to build. Always, because there is always a subset of people in the world who need what you have to offer. And I really believe that in my heart. So don't let the fact that everybody has a podcast deter you from creating one, or even deter you from creating one on the topic that speaks to your heart. Because like I said, the most important thing is to keep it going, is that it speaks to your heart. Okay. If it speaks to your heart, it's going to speak to other people's hearts, because we're human. And one other thing I'll say about that is, if you're feeling discouraged and deterred because there's already a podcast on a topic you want to do, that just means there's a market for it. So I say do it. If there's something that speaks to your heart and you want to do it, do it. Just don't copy the name. Don't plagiarize or copy word for word one of their episodes. Don't steal their artwork, and you're good. It's totally ethical. And there's enough room for everybody. I do believe that. I know that competition in business is something we've all been taught, but I have found over the last 4 years, when I stop competing and I start finding the people who are doing something similar to me, and I start collaborating with those people, we both grow. And that is one of the most important lessons I have learned over the course of doing Human Amplified, because I will tell you, I found when I first started, this was called On Being Human. And there's another podcast out there by an amazing woman named Susan Ruth, and her podcast is called Hey Human. And she's even had similar guests. We've had some of the same guests over the years. She started doing her podcast before me. And it's also on the human condition. And when she started, she was based in Nashville. She's in LA now. But I was like, oh no, I don't want to like take anything away from her. I don't want to step on her toes. I'm not trying to do that. But when I searched my name and came up with my concept, I did not find her and did not know she existed. But once I found her, I was like, is she competition? And then I was like, wait a minute. I'm just going to reach out to her. And I love what she's doing. I love what she has to say. I love her perspective. She does it differently than I do it, even if we have a similar concept. And you know what? I ended up having her on the show. She has thrown guests my way over the years, and I've thrown guests her way over the years. I've met publicists because I've had her on the show. And it just goes to show you that if you open your heart and you approach things as a collaboration, it can be so valuable. There's enough room for everybody, and I truly believe that. So I didn't think I was going to give you a pep talk about not being discouraged, but that is really important. Okay. And I mean it. All right. So we have about 8 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to talk about season 4. That is, it's launch week. We're launching on January 11th. We are premiering with, a guest who I have wanted to have on the show since the beginning. And I waited to ask her to be on the show because I was like, I want the audience to be built. I want it to be good for her. And I want it to be good for everybody who's going to be on the show. But I was just so nervous about this particular guest because I just admire her so much. And yes, I really do admire all the guests. I form relationships with the guests. I end up maintaining relationships with lots of them after I've met them and they come on the show. Sometimes I reconnect with people that I've already known or knew for years to come on the show. And that brings me to guests. How do you get guests for your podcast? Well, when I first started, I reached out to people I knew. I contacted friends, I contacted family. And in journalism school, it's difficult. It's different for me because, like, yes, I apply journalistic principles to all of the content I'm creating, but I do break some of the rules because a podcast can also be entertainment. This is not just a news source. If it's news, at least the way we do it at Human Amplified, it's soft news at the best, which is more like human interest pieces. So I consider it entertainment. I also consider it education. So I think it's okay to break some of the rules, but it's good to know the rules before you break them. So all that to be said, I started small. I started in my closest circle and then started working my way out. And as you start asking people to come on your show, if you want to do a show with guests, you meet more people. They share their episode, somebody hears it, they're like, oh, that's cool. Then your friend tells you about it. And then you're like, oh, well, can I have their contact information? Do they have a good story? You can ask every guest that you have on your show if they know somebody who would be a good fit too. And then they'll give you contacts, and you just keep going from there. But the most important thing is that every person has a story, multiple stories. There's always a story. And they're all important. But you want to choose a guest based on what you think will be applicable to what your audience needs at the time, and then make it tie in to what they need. So you do want things to be timely, but like, in my opinion, if you're not doing just a hard news show about events that happen, current events, you want what you're doing also to be timeless. You want people to be able to revisit your episodes at any time for years and come back to them, and the content still be helpful, still be relevant. And that's how your show grows, in my opinion, because people can come back to it and use it when other people have moved on from that phase where they needed that content. New people come in when they're in that phase, and they can use that content, and it is just an amazing self-sustaining cycle, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it's fun, and it's helpful. And I just love it. I just love it. I could talk podcasting for hours, and I actually, we're running out of time here. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to talk for an hour straight in a non-scripted format, but look, here we are, because we're talking about something that we're passionate about, that I'm passionate about. And so that just goes to show you that reinforces that if your mission is heart-based, you will be able to sustain it. So the other thing, so I started small in my inner circle, the people I knew. I also started reaching out to people on social media. So I would follow people that were interesting to me, and I would pay attention. Be observant. And when you see somebody doing something that relates to the topic that you have, or creating something that relates to the topic you have, or achieving something in their lives that relates in some way, even if you haven't talked to this person for like 10 years, but you've just been Facebook friends for 10 years, reach out anyway. The worst they can say is no. At best, they'll say yes and be excited. And if they do say no, hopefully they'll still be flattered that you asked them, because you're showing interest in something. It's not creepy. I don't think it is. Honestly, over my years of asking people cold that I've reconnected with, I got so much out of it by overcoming the fear of seeming creepy for like reaching out and being like, I know we haven't talked for 10 years, but I noticed this on your Facebook feed. Well, everybody on Facebook or social media knows that if you're friends, people see your feed. And so I just let them know. Like, for instance, there was, so many people, but one of our most popular episodes is a rare disease episode. It was episodes 7 and 8 in the very, very beginning. And I worked with a guy whose wife has a rare disease, and I had been following her journey over his Facebook. I didn't even know her. And I thought, wow, this is such an inspirational story, but how am I going to talk to them? Well, you know what? I overcame my fear, and I messaged him and I said, hey, do you think your wife, you could connect me to your wife? I would be so interested in hearing more about her story, and I would love to help her get the word out and inspire other people. I think it would really help people. And I know that it's helped me as I have followed it. And that's true. That's complimentary. That's from my heart. There's nothing to be afraid of when you reach out like that. And you know what? Now I have been friends with his wife for 4 years. She had one of the most popular episodes, and we keep in touch, and I still follow her journey and her new journeys and adventures. And I love hearing from her. We text, and there was nothing to lose from reaching out. And over time, your circle gets bigger and bigger and it ripples out. And then people start coming to you, which I know we're out of time here, but I'm going to take a few more minutes to tell you that for season 4, we went from, in season 1, me reaching out to my inner circle, to season 2, me reaching out to their inner circle, mostly, and then other people who were in my outer circle or periphery. And then to season 3, people coming to me here and there, and me finding people through them. By season 4, I've had people emailing me since season 3 asking to be on the show. And if I don't, at this point, if I don't want to search for specific guests to be on the show, I don't have to. And I feel weird saying that, because it's not like I'm not bragging, but it's such a milestone that excites me so much. But I still do. I will vet the guests that people submit for consideration, whether it's a publicist, it's friends of friends, people submit themselves. They find the podcast now and they email me and they're like, hey, can I be on your show? I have a wait list for the next season. I've already got somebody on the wait list for season 5, and season 4 hasn't even aired. That's amazing. And it just goes to show you that you can do it. You can reach out and it gets easier. It really does. It gets easier. People find your show, people talk about your show, and then they come to you. And that's why I'm so excited about season 4. It is just packed with some of the biggest guests we've ever had. It drops every Tuesday, starting January 11th, and runs through June. We were only going to run it through May, but I had so many people coming that I just was like, okay, I'll open up 1 or 2 more slots, and then I'm gonna have to start turning people away. And I know, I feel like it blows my mind. It blows my mind. And I'm so excited. And I just thank you, patrons. Thank you, guests. Thank you, universe. Thank you, God. Thank you, everybody. And I'm just so grateful and blown away by it. And I want you to not be scared to go get guests for your show if you want to start a show. Okay. That was a lot. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me tell you a few things here. I think that's it. I had a list of software and equipment for you that I did not get to go through, and we didn't get to answer all of the frequently asked questions. So I'll post some of that in the Backstage Pass resource library for you, and we can go over that if you're interested. I can't wait to interact with you on Patreon. I can't wait to see where this relationship goes. And again, thank you so much for being here. I love you. I love you.